Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good day to each and everyone, especially to you, ma'am. I am Saula Ismail Sumampaw,
And I am Asrafi Abbas.
and we are the reporter number 1 entitled Philosophical Perspective of the Self. And now, we were going to discuss or explain what about that topic. Okay, to explain that, according to Collins, a particular perspective is a particular way of thinking about something, especially one that is influenced by your beliefs or experiences. Now, if I say someone has a perspective, we mean he or she has a sensible outlook of life. Perspective is the way that one looks at something. It is also an art technique that changes the distance or that open object on a paper. For example, a perspective is farmer's opinion about a lack of grain. Now, what is a life perspective? Life perspective is the way people see life, including the way they approach life, and all there is in their personal experiences. In this life, few things are absolutely right, or should I say wrong. What we usually have are two different perspective life in only one thing. Now, at this point, we are going to tackle the philosophical perspective of the self. So we have a list here for learning outcomes where at the end of this chapter, student should be able to explain the role of philosophy in understanding the concept of self, discuss the different concept of the self from the philosophical perspective, differentiate the various concepts of the self, and identify their similarities, and develop your own philosophy of the self. So, let us know first what is philosophy. Philosophy is all about finding answers to serious questions about ourselves and about the world we live in. Okay, so basically here we are questioned how and why. And the example question are what are the controversial question about? For example, abortion, also the same-sex marriage. So these are the controversial topics. So the question is, it is a right or wrong? If it's a right, then why? What are your bases? And if it's a wrong, then why? What are your bases too? So basically, it is a also concern of philosophy we are asking, and at the same time we are finding the answer to our question. What are you consider as a good life? This is another thing. For example, you are rich. You have access everything. You have wealth. You can buy everything you want or you anything you want. But you don't have your family. You don't have your friends. You don't have anything. Or you don't have anyone. You are alone only. So, this is what you consider as a good life? Or let us switch it. You are poor, but you have your family. You have your friends, you have anyone, but you are poor. So, that we consider as a good life? So definitely the question is hard, right? Okay, next question. Does the God exist? Is there a God? If there, then how many God are there? There is one, two, or many more? So also a hard question. So basically, philosophy is concerning a question existing knowledge and think soon to get closer to teacher. Philosophy employs the inquisitive mind to discover the ultimate causes, reasons, and principles of everything. It goes beyond the scientific investigation by exploring all areas of knowledge such as religion, psychology, politics, physics, and even the medicine. Mean, the philosophy is something about to study the basic ideas about knowledge, what is right and what is wrong, and also the value of things. Philosophy is an analysis of the grounds and concept of expressing a fundamental beliefs. Hence, the etymological definition of philosophy is love of wisdom. Could pertain the desire for truth by formulating the never-ending question to provide the answer to every inquiry about the nature of human existence. The nature of the self is a topic interest among philosophers. For me, love of wisdom is demonstrated by constantly seeking wisdom, by processing data into information, and processing information into knowledge, and processing knowledge into wisdom. Loving wisdom is shown by enjoying the process of processing information. The philosophical framework for understanding the self was first introduced by the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. In particular, Socrates suggests know thyself. But what exactly does know thyself mean? What is self and the qualities that define it? This chapter presents to us an overview of the philosophical perspective of the self to assist us on how to identify one's own self to gain self-knowledge. It intends to give a wider perspective in understanding the self, the different views of prominent philosophers regarding the nature of the self. So those are the notable philosophers who propose their
The philosophy of Socrates. Socrates was considered as one of the masterminds of his times. Known as the founder of Western thought, he was an enigmatic personality. Very little of what he thought and preached are available in print. All that is known are through his disciples, especially Plato. Here, we attempt to decipher some of the unraveled mysteries of this great philosopher. Socrates was not born in an affluent family. His father was a mason, and in his initial years, he took up work with his father. People of his standings in Athens of those times got a basic education in Greek, which he too got. His interests were elsewhere, but he continued to be good sculptor. In those days, Greek men were considered handsome only when their facial features and body contours matched, but he had none of these. He was not very clean in his habits. He was found chit-chatting with men and women in the streets in shabby clothes and without footwear. It is said that he wouldn't change his clothes for days on end. None of these bothered him. He felt real education was when questions were answered and answers were found. In fact, all his lectures were based on this. He would question and seek answers from his students and audience. This was popularized by his student Plato and came to be known as the Socratic method or Elenchus. This continues till day, being a common pedagogical method through which meaningful insights of the questions asked are found. Socrates made meaningful contributions in ethics and epistemology. His views and governance met with antagonism, and finally he was put to death by poison. Even though his friends pleaded with him to ask for exile, he refused, saying he went by the law of Athens. He took hemlock, which was the poison administered to end a person's life. Though he has not made any of his works public by writing, he lives on for posterity thanks to his able student Plato.
He was an ancient Greek philosopher. He was born in Athens, Greece, on 428 before Christ. His father's name was Ariston, and mother's name was Pariction. His father and mother was philosopher. He was born in a wealthy and aristocratic family. Some scholars believe that he was named Aristocles after his grandfather, and was later called Plato because of his broad physical build. He had two brothers, Glaucon and Adeimantus, and a sister named Paetin. His father died when Plato was still a child. Thereafter, his mother married her uncle. It is possible that Plato had studied grammar, music, and gymnastics under renowned educators of the time. From the writings of Aristotle, we also know that Plato studied under Athenian philosopher Cratylus, who introduced him to the teachings of Heraclitus. After leaving Athens, Plato traveled for 12 years, visiting places around the Mediterranean coast such as Syracuse, Italy, Egypt, and Cyrene. For some time, he studied mathematics under the Pythagoreans in Italy. What he learned there later helped him to form his own ideas. In Egypt, he studied geometry, geology, astronomy, and religion. It was here that he learned to make water clock, which he later introduced in Athens. It is believed the Apology of Socrates, his first major work, was written shortly after the death of Socrates. Some other works of this period are Protagoras, Euthyphro, Hippias Major and Minor, and Ion. All these were written in dialogue form through which Plato attempted to convey the philosophy and teachings of Socrates. Around this time, Plato also visited Syracuse, which was under the rule of tyrant King Dionysius I, whose brother-in-law Dion had become Plato's disciple. It angered Dionysius, and Plato was sold into slavery. Fortunately, Anicetus, another of his disciples, was able to buy his freedom for 20 minas and send him home. Plato returned to Athens in 387 BC. In the same year, he founded his academy on a plot of land in the Grove of Academus, outside the city wall of Athens. It is said to be the first organized school in the Western world. Plato's famous book, The Republic, was written sometime during this period. He was dead in Athens, Greece on 348 before Christ, at the age of 80. You can discover more about a person in an hour of play than in a year of conversation, said Plato. He was a philosopher and teacher of Alexander the Great. He was born in 384 before Christ, on Stagira, Greece. His father's name was Nicomachus. His father Nicomachus named him Aristotle, which means the best purpose. His father served as a personal physician to King Amyntas of Macedon. Being a physician's son, he was inspired to his father's scientific work, but didn't show much interest in medicine. When he turned 18, he shifted to Athens to pursue his education at Plato's academy. He left Athens somewhere in 348-347 before Christ, spending almost 20 years in the city. In 343 before Christ, after the death of Hermias, Philip II of Macedon invited him to become the tutor of his son, Alexander. Aristotle became the head of Royal Academy of Macedon. Here he became a tutor, not only to Alexander, but gave lessons to two other future kings, Cassander and Ptolemy, as well. In his role as tutor to Alexander, he encouraged him to conquer East. In 335 before Christ, he returned to Athens, where he established his own school called Lyceum. For the next 12 years, Aristotle organized his school as a center of research on astronomy, zoology, geography, geology, physics, anatomy, and many other fields. Aristotle wrote 170 books, 47 of which still exist more than 2,000 years later. Aristotle was also a philosopher who wrote about ethics, psychology, economics, theology, political science, and rhetoric. Later inventions such as the telescope and the microscope would prove many of Aristotle's theories to be incorrect, but his ideas formed the basis of modern science. Aristotle married 2 times. First time to Pythias. A daughter was born to the couple. Later he married to Herpulus of Stagira. They blessed with a son. He breathed his last in 322 before Christ in Euboea due to natural causes at the age of 62. Pleasure in the job puts perfection in the work, said Aristotle.
So the first one is Socrates. He proposed an examined life is not worth living. For Socrates, the self is synonymous with the soul. He believes that every human possesses an immortal soul to survive the physical body. Socrates was the first to focus on full power of season on the human self, who we are and who was should be and who will become. Socrates suggests that really consists of 2 dichotomous realms, physical and ideal realm. The physical realm is changeable and transient and imperfection. The ideal realm is unchanging, eternal, and immortal. The physical world in which man lives belongs to the physical realm. For Socrates, the body belongs to the physical realm. On the other hand, the unchanging, eternal, perfect realm includes the intellectual essence of the universe. Concepts such as truth, goodness, and beauty, the soul belongs to the ideal realm. Socrates explained that the essence of the self, the soul, is an mortal entity. The soul strives for wisdom and perfection, and reason is the sole tool to achieve this exalted state. But then, as long as the soul is tied to the body, Socrates thus suggests that man must live examine life and a life of purpose and value. For him, an examined life is not worth living. He must begin at the source of all knowledge and significance, the self. The Socratic method, the called introspection, is a method of carefully examining one's thoughts and emotions to gain self-knowledge.
According to Socrates, a life without a purpose is not worth living. You should be know the meaning of value of life. You should only be happy if you have a virtues and know your life value. And, and we will achieve it. We have essence soul researching. Socrates as a method of called introspection, a method of carefully examining one of two an emotion to gain to self-knowledge. According to Socrates, every man is dualistic, composed of body and soul, two important aspects of this. Number one, personhood, body imperfect and impermanent, soul. Number two, perfect and impermanent.
So let's proceed to the next one, which is Plato. So Plato proposed the self is an immortal soul. Plato was a student of Socrates, and he said that philosophy of the self can be explained as a process of self-knowledge and purification of the soul. So according to Plato, the soul has three parts, which is the number one is rational soul. So the rational soul is the reason and intellect divine essence that never asks to think deeply, make wise choices, and achieve a true understanding of eternal truths. So basically, the rational soul is the thinking of soul or intellect of soul. So number two is spirited soul. So spirited soul is the emotion and passion. It is a love, anger, ambition, and aggressiveness, and many more. Well, this is more on emotion. So number three is appetitive soul. So appetitive soul is concerned on basic needs. It includes a biological needs such as hunger, thirst, and sexual desire. So these three elements of ourselves are in a dynamic relationship with one another. Sometimes is in a conflict. When the conflict occurs, Plato believed it is the responsibility of reason to sort things out and exert control. Also, restoring a harmonious relationship among the three elements of ourselves. Furthermore, Plato believes that genuine happiness can only be achieved by people who consistently make sure that their reason is in control of their spirit and appetite. So, in his theory of forms, he also introduced the concept of the two worlds. The number one world of forms, which bases the real and permanent. The number two, the world of sense, which temporarily and only a replica of a ideal world.
The third one, Aristotle, another Greek philosopher. Aristotle believes that soul is merely as a set of defining future, and does not consider the body and soul as separate entities. He suggests that anything with the life as a soul. Aristotle holds that the soul is the essence of all living things. Thus, the soul is the essence of the self. However, humans differ from other living things because of their capacity for rational thinking. He is discussed about the self center on the kinds of soul. possessed by a man. Thus, he introduced the three kinds of soul: vegetable, and sentient and rational. Vegetative soul include the physical body and that can grow. Sentient soul include the sense make a human include the intellect that allow a man to know, to understand things. Thus, Aristotle suggests that rational nature of the self is the lead a good flourishing and fulfilling life. Self-authorization include doing virtues and action. In saying this, he posits the part of rational soul is characterized by moral virtues, such as justice and courage. Aristotle says the soul is the essence of self. Aristotle is the Greek philosopher. He believes that soul is merely a set of those not considered the body and soul separate. According to him, anything with life has soul as human, animals and plant has soul as a soul. But humans differ from other lives things because their thinking level. He, he introduced three kinds of soul. Vegetative soul. This, this, this is where physical body that can grow. Sentient, your feeling and emotion include the desire. Rational soul is what makes you human. This include intellect that allow us to know and understand things.
So next proceed to the next one, which is Saint Augustine. He proposed that the self has an immortal soul. He is an African philosopher. He integrated the ideas of Plato and teaching of Christianity. Saint Augustine believes that the physical body is radically different from an interior to the inhabitant. The immortal soul, and his thinking matured. He developed a more unified perspective on the body and soul. He ultimately came to view the body as spouse of the soul, both attached to one another by a natural appetite. He believes that the body is united with the soul, so that man may be entire and complete. Nevertheless, as a religious philosopher, he contemplates on the nature of man with emphasis on the soul as an important element of man. He believes that the soul is what governs and defines man. In this work, Confessions, Augustine described that humankind is created in the image and likeness of God. Okay, so Saint Augustine integrated the idea of Plato and Christianity. So basically, it talks about more on religion's perspective. Well, Augustine's view of the human person reflects the entire spirit of the medieval world. The soul is united with the body, so that the man may be entire and complete. He believed that humankind is created in the image and likeness of God. So, he believed too that you cannot be completed without the soul. If man is only existing with his body and without the soul, then he is not complete. So there should be a singularity of body and soul. It should be inseparable. So to point out what St. Augustine wants to convey, it's simply that knowing God is equal to knowing ourselves.
Another one, René Descartes. I think, therefore I am. French philosopher René Descartes is the father of modern philosophy. He has brought an entirely new perspective to philosophy and the self. He wants to penetrate the nature of reasoning, process and understand its relationship to the human self. The Latin phrase cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, the keystone of Descartes' concept of the self. For him, the act of thinking about the self, of being self-conscious, is the itself proof that there is self. He confident that a rational person will doubt this hour existing a conscious thinking entity, while are away thinking about the self for this. Descartes, this is the essence of human self-thinking entity. The doubt, understand, analyze, question, and reason. He contends further that if a man reflects truthfully, he will realize that there are two dimensions of the human self. The self as René Descartes, a thinking entity, and the self as a physical body. In the particular, he introduced the idea of thinking self, our soul, a non-material, immortal conscious being independent of the physical laws of organizing principle that make unified intelligible experience possible. Is metaphorically above or behind sense experience, and is used the categories of our mind of filter other relate organize and synthesize sensation into unified whole. On other words, the self construct its own reality actively and create a world that is familiar, predictable, and the most significantly mind and self product and reason. Regulative principle because the regulate experience by making unified experience possible. The self translate experience because the mind and grasp aspect reality which are not limited to the sense. Through rationality, people are able to understand certain abstract and ideas have no corresponding physical, objective, or sensory experience. According to René Descartes, I think, therefore I am. René Descartes is a French philosopher, he father of modern philosopher. The Latin phrase cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, the keystone of Descartes. He is a way act about the yourself is proof that there is a self.
Let's move on to the another one, which is John Locke, that he proposed that the self is consciousness. He is an English philosopher that the human mind at birth is tabula rasa, or a blank slate. He feels that the self or personal identity is constructed primarily from sense experiences, or more specifically, what people see, hear, smell, taste, and feel. These experiences shape and mold the self throughout a person's life. For Locke, consciousness, awareness, and memory of previous experiences are the keys to understanding the self. Locke believes that the sense of the self it is its conscious awareness of itself as a thinking, reasoning, and reflecting identity. He contends that consciousness accompanies thinking and makes possible that concept people have of a self. Self-consciousness is necessary to have a coherent personal or self identity or knowledge of the self as a person. Consciousness is what makes identity of a person similar in different situations. At this point, Locke is proposing that people could use the power of reason to gain knowledge and consequently use this knowledge to understand experiences. Knowledge is based on careful observation of experiences. Reason plays an important role in helping to figure out the significance of sense experiences and to reach intelligent conclusion. Thus, using the power of reason and introspection enables one to understand and achieve accurate conclusion about the self or a personal identity. So according to him, the human kind of a bird is tabula rasa or blank slate. So what is tabula rasa first? So tabula rasa is from the Latin word scrap tablet or clean slate in epistemology, which is theory of knowledge and psychology. A supposed condition that empiricists have attributed to the humankind before idea has been imprinted on it by the reaction of the sense to the external world object. So his point is when we are born, we are like a blank of paper that has no letter or anything written on it. But because of what we experience in life, the blank is having a content. So he felt that the self is constructed primarily from the sense of experiences. John Locke holds that personal identity is a matter of psychological continuity. He considered personal identity on a self to be founded on consciousness and not substitute either a soul or a body. Body.
Let's proceed to David Hume. Scottish philosopher David Hume. David Hume suggests that the people carefully examine their sense experience. Through the process of introspection, they will discover that there is no self. According to Hume, what people experience is just a bundle of collection of different perception. Hume maintained that if people carefully examine the content of their experience, they will find that there are only distinct entities and impressions and ideas. Impressions are the basic sensation of people experience, such as hate, grief, pain, cold, and heat. Impressions are vivid perception, love, joy, grief, pain, and, and are strong and lively ideas. However, are the true image. So they are less lively, vivid, Hume further proceed in the constant continuum that is imperable and not constant. Hume argues that this cannot be from any of their impression, that the idea of self derived and consequence there is no self. Hume skeptically claim on this issue is the people have experience of a simplified individual impression they call the self where and the self is totally of person consequence. Life responsibility in the idea of person identify is a result of imagination. According to David Hume, there is no self. He is Scottish philosopher, and according to Hume, he is your carefully examined sense experience through the imperception. There is no self. What people experience perception is a bundle of collection of different perception. Is the people examine there is life experience, they will find no self about idea. Impressions are the basic sensation of people experience such as hate, love, and joy, grief, pain, and cold and heat. They are strong and lively.
So let's proceed to the other one, which is Immanuel Kant. So Immanuel Kant proposed that we contract the self. Here is a German philosopher. It is the self that make experiencing an intelligible world possible because it is the self that is actively organizing and synthesizing all of our thoughts and perception. The self is the form of consciousness, utilizes conceptual categories, which he calls transcendental deduction of categories, to construct an orderly and objective world that is stable and can be investigated scientifically. Kant believed that the self is an organizing principle that makes a unified and intelligible experience possible. It is a metaphorically above or behind sense experience, and it is used the categories of our mind to filter, order, relate, organize, and synthesize sensation into a unified whole. In other words, the self constructs its own reality, actively creating a world that is familiar, predictable, and most significantly mine. The self is the product of reason, a regulative principle because the self regulates experience by making unified experience possible. The self transcends experience because the mind can grasp aspects of reality which are not limited to the senses. Through rationality, people are able to understand certain abstract ideas that have no corresponding physical object of sensory experiences.
So let's move on the other one, Immanuel Kant. So Immanuel Kant proposed that we contract the self. So according to him, we all have a inner and outer self, which together form our consciousness. The inner self is comprised of our psychological state and our rational intellect, and the outer self is includes our sense and the physical world. When we speaking of the inner self, there is a perception. A perception. Self is not just what gives one his personality, but also the seat of knowledge. Self is not just what gives one his personality, but also the seat of knowledge acquisition for all human person. So the self is constructs its own reality, creating a world that is familiar and predictable. Through our rationally. The self transcends sense experience. He also said that if we are going to reflect on it, there is self because our mind it organized our experiences. That's why he said that the self is the product of reason. So our mind who construct the reality.
Now, let's proceed to the next one. We have the Sigmund Freud. So, the Sigmund Freud concept of the self is multi-layered. He is an Austrian psychoanalyst. He is not a philosopher, but his view on the nature of the self have a far-reaching impact on philosophical thinking, as well as other disciplines such as psychology and sociology. Freud holds that the self consists of three layers: conscious, unconscious, and preconscious. The conscious self is governed by the reality principle. The conscious part of the self is organized in ways that are rational, practical, and appropriate to the environment. The conscious self usually takes into account the realistic demands of the situation, the consequences of various actions, and the overriding need to preserve the equilibrium or the balance of the entire psychodynamic system of the self. In contrast, the unconscious part of the self contains the basic instinctual drives including sexuality, aggressiveness, and self-destruction, traumatic memories, unfulfilled wishes, and childhood fantasies, and thoughts and feelings that would be considered socially taboo. The unconscious the unconscious level is characterized by the most primitive level of human motivation and human functioning, which is governed by the pleasure principle. Freud argues that much of the self is determined by the unconscious. On the other hand, the preconscious self contains a material that is not threatening and is easily brought to mind. According to Freud, the preconscious part is located between the conscious and the unconscious part of the self.
Let's move on to the next one. We have the Sigmund Freud. So first of all, Sigmund Freud is not a philosopher, but his point, his view of the nature of the self is far-reaching impact on philosophical of the self. So Sigmund Freud concept of the self is multi-layered. His view of self which divided among the conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. So he also explained his psychological model in the following passage from his Outlife and Psychohouses. It is mean by no exaggeration assert that the concept of the unconsciousness forms is the central core in Freud's theory. Freud's theory of the structure and dynamic of the human personality. And the conscious self have an important role to play in our lives. It is the unconscious self that holds the greatest fascination for Freud's and which has the dominant influence in our personalities.
Another one, British philosopher Gilbert Ryle, believes that the self is the best understood as a pattern of behavior, the tendency or disposition of a person behave in certain way in certain circumstances. Ray's concept of the human self thus provide the philosophically principle act therefore I am. Right consider the mind and the body to be intrinsically linked in the complex and eliminate way. In short, the self is the same as bodily behavior. He concluded that the mind is the totality of human disposition. That I know through the way people behave. Nevertheless, Rai is universe. In contrast, the physical body is materials mortal, non-thinking entity, fully governed by the physical law of nature. In other words, the soul and the body are the independent of one of another, and each other with the function without the another. The essential self, the self as thinking entity, and distinct from the self as a physical body. Simplify put, the thinking self can exist independently of the physical body. According to Gilbert Ray, the self is the way people behave. He is British philosopher. He is believed the self is the best understood as a pattern of behavior. The way the person behave in a certain way, circumstances is the pattern of behavior. The self is the same of bodily behavior. The pattern of person act define their self. Canadian philosopher Paul Churchland advocate the idea of eliminated materialism, or the idea that the self is inseparable from the brain and the physiology of the body. All a person as is the brain, and the others is the brain, and so the brain is gonna, there is no self. For Charles Land, the physical brain and not the imaginary mind, give people the sense of self. The mind does not really exist because it cannot exercise experienced by the sense. Paul Cersland, the self is a brain. He is Canadian philosopher, advocate, advocate the idea of eliminated materialism, or an idea that the self is inseparable from brain and body. All of us, a person has a brain. If the brain is gone, there is no self. Persons and physical brain give the people the sense of life.
So the last one, we have Maurice Merleau-Ponty. So Maurice proposed that the self is embodied subjectivity. He is a French philosopher which argues that all knowledge about the self, for example, understanding the nature of the self, is based on the phenomena of experience. The I is a single integrated core identity, a combination of the mental, physical, and emotional structure around a core identity of the self. He further articulates that when people examine the self at the fundamental levels of direct human experience, people will discover that the mind and body are unified, not separate. He notes in his book Phenomenology of Perception that everything that people are aware of is contained within the consciousness. Consciousness is a dynamic form responsible for actively structuring conscious ideas and physical behavior. He is convinced that consciousness, the world, and the human body are intricately intertwined in perceiving the world. For him, perception is not merely a consequence of sensory experience. Rather, it is a conscious experience. Thus, the self is embodied subjectivity.
Marlis Merleau-Ponty phenomenological philosophy suggests the search for the self and consciousness need not be focused on the space within our skulls. Instead, we should turn our attention to the lived body. Merleau-Ponty focused on the ways in which our embodiment is central to our consciousness and self. The mind-body purification that has been going on tap a long time is a futile and endeavor and an invalid problem. All knowledge of ourselves and our world is based on subjective experiences. So the self can never be truly objectified or known in a completely objective sort way. So the self is embodied subjectivity. Okay, when we say mind, body purification, or should I say it is the division of something into two parts, and then we say futile word has no sense or no purpose. So this one, the mind and body are intertwined. Both of them is part of creating who we are. So there is no sense of mind by purification or division because we can't separated the mind and the body because they are intertwined. So that is what Merleau concept of the self. For the last of this chapter, me and my partner were going to list here the summary of their point of those notable philosophers.
The number one, Socrates suggests that the life is synonymous with the soul. He believes that every human possesses an immortal soul that survives the physical body. Number two, for Plato, the three elements of the soul or self are reason, physical appetite, and spirit or passion. Reason is the divine essence that enables people to think deeply, make wise choices, and achieve a true understanding of eternal truths. The physical appetite includes the basic biological needs, while the spirit or passion includes the basic emotion. Number three, Aristotle suggests that the rational nature of the self is to lead a good, flourishing, and fulfilling life. Number four, Augustine believes that the body is united with the soul so that man may be entire and complete. Number three, Descartes suggests that the act of thinking about the self or being self-conscious is proof that there is a self. There are two dimensions of the human self, the self as a thinking entity and the self as a physical body. Number six, Locke believes that conscious awareness and memory of previous experiences are the keys to understanding the self. He believes that the essence of the self is its conscious awareness of itself as a thinking, reasoning, and reflecting identity. Number seven, to Hume, the idea of personal identity is a result of imagination, and that if the person carefully examines his sense experience through the process of introspection, he will discover that there is no self. Number eight, according to Kant, the self constructs its own reality, actively creating a world that is familiar and predictable. Number nine, Freud holds that the self consists of three layers: conscious, unconscious, and preconscious. Number 10, Ryle believes that the self is best understood as a pattern of behavior, the tendency of disposition for a person to behave in a certain way in certain circumstances. Number 7, Churchland advocates that idea of eliminative materialism, or the idea that the self is inseparable from the brain and the physiology of the body. Number 12, according to Merleau-Ponty, all knowledge about the self is based on the phenomena of experience.